Thank you very much, Meg. And welcome everybody to this seminar, the second of the calendar year. And I'm delighted to introduce this evening Amy Jeffs, Dr. Amy Jeffs, who wrote a brilliant PhD at Cambridge, which she finished up about a year ago, I think. And it went through flying colours, and it's on a fascinating manuscript in the British Library, a romance manuscript of the 14th century, very little studied, British Library Egerton manuscript 3028, and other things as well, not just one manuscript, but really Amy is interested in the representation of narrative and romance in general in the sort of Central and later Middle Ages, and particularly interested in the British history and, you know, the Monmouthian tradition and the competing historiographical traditions, both made up and yeah, with a semblance of truth about them. Amy is currently on a postdoctoral fellowship, which is funded by the Paul Mellon Centre, and she's using that time to write up her PhD into a book. She's a former BAA council member. She's published in a number of journals, Apollo, British Art Studies, and recently in the special issue on Beckett of the Journal of the British Archaeological Association. Extremely interesting and thought-provoking article there. Amy's an artist, she's a singer-songwriter, and she's an all-round good thing. And I'm delighted to welcome her to speak now. Her talk has the title, Living Legends, the Art of Adventure in English Manuscripts, circa 1240 to 1340. Thank you very much, Amy.
Great, thank you, Julian. What a nice introduction. And it's so lovely to be here with everyone at the BAA, even if I can't see any of you. I've dreamt of this moment. But I'm not very Zoom savvy, so I'm going to share screen with a PowerPoint. Right, that should be working, and I should be able to, there we go. Message me if something's wrong. Okay. Good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's a privilege to be taking the virtual lectern after some 6 years seated happily in the audience. I'll start with a concise statement of intent and then launch straight in. I hope to show over the next 50 minutes or so that British myth and the aesthetic of military adventure allied in the pages of an English manuscript made at the start of the 100 Years' War. I will argue that this elision was politically persuasive because it imbued contemporary wars with legendary potential. My research is indebted to the work of such as Marion Ailes, Philippa Hardman, Laura Cleaver and Laura Slater, but a helpful springboard for this discussion is given by Juliet Vale in her book on Edward III in Chivalry. Edward III's success in unifying the nobility has become almost commonplace in general textbooks of the period, but the mechanics of this process appear to have been little studied. It is mechanics by means of 3 manuscript case studies taken respectively from the reigns of Edward I, II, and III that I want to consider here, and especially focusing on the manuscript from the reign of Edward III. So I found this actual photograph of Geoffrey of Monmouth that I thought would really bring to life the introduction of the Brute tradition. And I know this will be familiar territory for many, but I'll introduce the opening of the Brute narrative nonetheless. And because this is what is shared by the case studies we're about to look at, and I'll talk about why it began to have political relevance, or it sort of did from the start, but not historically. So the History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, pictured here by the BBC, was written circa 1136. It begins with how Aeneas has journeyed from the fallen Troy to Italy, where he establishes a kingdom. The birth of his great-grandson, Brutus, is shrouded in prophecy. But when Brutus grows up, he kills his father in a hunting accident and is exiled. While wandering the Mediterranean, he discovers an arm of the Trojan diaspora enslaved by the Greek king. He overthrows the king and takes his daughter Imogen in marriage. Returning to his wanderings, Brutus finds an ancient temple of Diana on a deserted island. He sacrifices a white hart, appealing to the goddess as to where he should establish his kingdom. Diana appears to him in a dream, telling him to sail to an island in the Western Ocean beyond Gaul, which is uninhabited but for a few giants. She tells him that this will be where he founds a new Troy and a line of kings that will rule the whole round world. Brutus and the Trojans come to Albion, picking up some fellow countrymen on the way, and when they reach the island, they overthrow the giants. And for more on this, see the work of Alex Bovey. Brutus renames the island Britain after himself. Imogen bears 3 sons, Locrine, Camber, and Albonac, between whom Brutus divides the territory of Britain. Locrine, the eldest, receives Lurgria, later England, while Camber and Albonac receive Cambria, later Wales, and Albany, later Scotland. This opening is followed by accounts of the reigns of kings and queens, including King Arthur, all the way up to the coming of the Saxons. The text was swiftly translated into vernacular verse and prose by authors like Wass and Layamon. By as early as the mid-12th century, the so-called Brute tradition had been born, also known as the Matter of Britain. By the late reign of Edward I, here's Edward I, the Brute was being used to validate contemporary English political action. In 1291, Edward I agreed to arbitrate a Scottish succession dispute on condition that he be recognised by all the claimants as their overlord. In preparation for this, he had instructed the abbots of England to mine their libraries for evidence to support his claim to suzerainty. They responded with the story of Brutus' colonisation of Albion, presenting Locrine, who received the territory that would become England, not only as the eldest of Brutus's 3 sons, but as their overlord, a detail not given in Geoffrey of Monmouth. For the time being, the Scottish barons conceded. These events bring us to Bodley Rolls 3, a genealogical roll dating to the late 13th century. It opens with an amazing cycle of narrative images, illustrating legendary history from Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece to Diana's prophecy to Brutus. Thereafter, it presents a royal genealogy from Brutus to the Plantagenets on the throne of England, ending with Edward I. It portrays the Brute legend as part of England's own regnal history, and scholars before me have argued for its patrons' clear interest in arguing Edward I's claim to suzerainty of Scotland. It bears a circa 1300 ex libris from the Library of St. Mary's Abbey, York, the home of England's government records from 1298 to 1305, when during the campaign against the Scots, York was the centre of the English royal administration. Its early audience is therefore likely to have been largely chivalric and secular, and it is to this audience that we might infer the illustrations were designed to appeal. In its current form, Bodley Rolls 3 measures roughly 4 metres by 50 centimetres, and opens with 20 large roundels. The first 2 rows of roundels represent Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece, which will secure his place on the throne of Iolcus in Thessaly. The opening roundel shows the usurper King Peleus in dialogue with Jason, that's up in the top left. Peleus is one of 3 brothers, the eldest of whom, Aeson, ruled Thessaly until Peleus overthrew him and claimed his throne. According to the text beneath the roll image, the scene shows Peleus telling Jason, Aeson's son, that he will only be given the throne of Iolcus if he fetches the Golden Fleece. Bearing in mind the English political context discussed above, the story's concern with the rightful dominance of the eldest brother and the fate of the over-ambitious underling must be significant. The next 2 rows, actually, I'll just hop back and see. You can see down in the bottom right there, the Golden Fleece being borne off the ship. So it's a happy ending for Jason, as you all probably knew. And it's so the next 2 rows show 2 conquests of Troy by 2 separate armies. They open with Heracles unloading magical horses promised to but withheld from him by King Laomedon, father of Priam. Hercules and Telamon are then shown battling the Trojan army. Next, Telamon is depicted taking Laomedon's daughter, this is the top right, Hesione, as a reward from Heracles. Moving down a row, Paris and Helen are shown about to embark And the sacking of Troy by the Greeks is represented across 3 roundels, first with an image of the Greeks at sea, then with an image of 2 battling armies. And the Trojan side is shown pouring out of the city gates with such force, they've managed to break the roundel frame. The final 4 narrative roundels tell the legend of Brutus. They begin with an image of Aeneas and his fellow Trojans arriving in Latium. Then Brutus is shown with his band of liberated Trojans, armed and leading horses, pulling the Greek king from his bed. After that, the Greek king is shown giving his daughter Imogen to the Trojans, who now fill a ship and are readying once more to set sail. The prow of the Trojan ship glides into the subsequent roundel, and we come to Brutus sleeping on a deer hide before the statue of Diana. The caption gives her prophecy in the Latin of Geoffrey of Monmouth, concluding with the prediction that his progeny will rule the whole world. It is with this powerful coupling of text and image that the roundel sequence ends. It is accepted that one of the primary purposes of the narrative imagery of Bodley Rolls 3 is to use the brute myth to persuade viewers of the validity and appeal of a single imperial ruler of Britain. Referring to the genealogical diagrams following the narrative roundels, Joan Holliday notes the emphasis on Lochran as Brutus's heir, with his 2 brothers, the recipients of Wales and Scotland, receiving no visual treatment. So here on this side, you can see Brutus in the top left, and then sitting next to him, Lochran, who is pointing to Gwendolen, who is actually the daughter of Coroneus, Brutus's right-hand man, who kills the giant Gog-Magog, and she ends up killing Lochran, or her army does, and she takes his throne. So anyway, Lochran's pointing at her very crossly, but he's crucially not shown with his 2 brothers. So that means that the subsequent visual journey through the roundels all the way down to Edward I may be read as a statement of English royal supremacy within Britain as a whole. The narrative illustrations of Bodley Rolls 3 are fast-paced and compelling, not only as a political argument being made, the dramatic potential of images is being exploited to engage the emotions and imagination of the viewer. With its multiple dramatic climaxes, the acquisition of the Golden Fleece, the 2 sackings of Troy, and Diana's prophecy, we might see the Bodley Rolls 3 sequence in rhetorical rather than purely genealogical terms. It seeks to persuade the viewer of the legitimacy of Edward I's ambitions by presenting them as a fitting continuation of the ancient legends his abbots kept chained in their libraries. Given Diana's promise of world domination, his plans are simply a necessary step in a much larger strategy. Which brings us to Royal MS 20A2, case study 2. Another rich cycle of brute images is found in Royal MS 20A2, which I date to 1327 or soon after. The cycle begins with creation, proceeds to a brute narrative, and ends with the reign of Edward II. I'll focus on the pre-conquest portion of the cycle here. I have argued that the Brutus to Edward the Confessor section of the Prefetary image cycle is not only followed by, but designed to accompany the Pierre de Langtoft chronicle, a vehemently anti-Scottish brute chronicle continued to the death of Edward I. But they are not all that easy to read. The layout of these opening miniatures may impede the narrative flow, but as I will demonstrate, it serves an important purpose in guiding the reader's interpretation of the text. I can't go through all the illustrated pages here, so I'll home in on the most relevant to the argument. Early on, Brutus' family is depicted on a single page divided into 2 registers. Brutus and Imogen are shown here, seated in the top register. The lower register shows their 3 sons. Their order, Cambert, Lochran, and Albonac, is suggested not only by 3 fragmentary labels in the bas de page, but by their arrangement and dress. As aforementioned, Brutus gives them each a portion of Britain, Wales for Cambert, England for Lochran, and Scotland for Albonac. The central brother, labelled, though perhaps by a later hand, as Lochran, wears a circlet instead of a helmet, carries a sword, and faces the viewer. The sword is associated with royal justice in medieval iconography, and suggests his identity as the most superior of the brothers. Given the political interests of the Pierre de Langtoft chronicle, and given the faded label, it is reasonable to identify this figure as Lochran. The very next spread includes an image of the burning of the usurper king Vortigern. I propose it to be part of a sophisticated programme over the spread, illustrating the legendary usurper's rise and fall. According to the Brute, the Emperor Constantine, rightful king of Britain as well as Roman emperor, had 3 sons, Constans, a monk, Aurelius, and Uther. When Constantine dies, a scheming and immoral courtier named Vortigern convinces Constans to take the throne despite his religious vows. Vortigern, plotting to seize the throne for himself, gradually imposes his will on the weak king, convincing him to invite Pictish mercenaries to his court who will help defend his kingdom. When the Picts arrive, Vortigern plies them with privileges and turns them against the king. They murder Constans, and the 2 younger brothers, Aurelius and Uther, still children, flee to Brittany, and Vortigern claims the throne. Accordingly, on the verso, the upper register shows the murder of Constans depicted in monastic habit. In the middle of the lower scene, a layman with a white stick looks out at the viewer, marking him out as the scene's subject. He points up at Constans, while the 3 men by whom he's accompanied also point and gesture. A beardless figure to his right, dressed in red and green, may represent the similarly clothed figure killing Constans in the scene above. If so, then he may be identifiable as one of the Picts whom Vortigern incites to regicide. If this is the case, then the central forward-facing figure must represent Vortigern, imagining the outcome of his scheme. The double register and ambiguous narrative flow encourage the eye to consider the relationship between intention and event, between political ambition and political history. Vortigern's fall from grace is explored on the recto. During Vortigern's reign, the noble and courteous Saxon brothers Hengist and Horsa arrive in Britain and are invited into the court. Hengist manipulates Vortigern, winning land from for the Saxons and subduing the British by massacring their nobles at a feast. Only one noble, Earl Eldolf of Gloucester, escapes alive. He allies with the rightful king of Britain, Constans' younger brother, Aurelius, who is living in Brittany with Uther. Meanwhile, Vortigern has fled the Saxons, who have got too big for their boots, and is hiding in Snowdonia, where he's building a tower for his own protection. But the tower won't stop falling down at night, and he receives prophetic counsel from the child Merlin. As well as identifying the source of the problems with the tower as being 2 dragons fighting in the hill, he prophesies that Vortigern faces 2 threats to his life, one from the Saxons and one from the Britons, led now by the grown-up Aurelius. Merlin then goes on to inform Vortigern that this same Aurelius will burn him to death in his castle. In the end, the prophecy comes true, Vortigern is killed, and the rightful king is restored to the throne. Beneath the image of Vortigern's death, the king is shown standing between 2 pairs of men. The image is accompanied by the faded label Une Reine et Sasson, a king in Saxons. The Saxons may be represented by the pair of finely dressed figures to the left of the king, perhaps identifiable as Hengist and Horsa. As with the image of Vortigern on the facing verso, the central figure, this time crowned, looks directly out at the viewer and points to himself. I suggest this king once more represents Vortigern, and once more he is beneath an image both imagined and actual. If the Saxons are on the left and Vortigern is in the middle, then it follows that the knight and the young man on the right, both of whom hold maces, represent the doughty Earl Eldolf of Gloucester and the rightful King Aurelius. The scene is in essence a depiction of Merlin's prophecy of the 2 threats to Vortigern's life, the Saxons and the Britons. If the young man does indeed represent Aurelius, then it explains why he's shown pointing to the conflagration overhead. He is the one who will ignite it, and that's the young man in red on the far right, bottom right. So the images across the spread depict Vortigern's visio imaginaria, as well as actual political events, according to medieval historiography. Unlike Bodley Rolls 3, there is no simple left to right narrative progression. Rather, the relationship is ambiguous, relevant as much to moments in time as to the role of treacherous intent and divine retribution in the playing out of history. It is a guided interpretation of the Brute narrative found in the Langtoft Chronicle. demanding the reader to retain the memory of either text or image to consult one in relation to the other. The prefetary image cycle may be seen to highlight the supremacy of Locrine, the downfall of usurpers, and the victory of the legitimate claimants. It thus supports a central concern in the following Pierre de Langtoft chronicle, epitomized by the lines, "The king goes to Norham, a castle well fortified, and there causes to be brought from abbey and priory all the chronicles of our forefathers. Examines the history, very clearly ascertains that Sir Edward has the right to the sovereignty." Royal MS 20A2 was made in or just after the reign of Edward II, so let's consider briefly the unfolding political situation in England. The Anglo-Scottish conflict remained a central political concern for the English well into Edward II's reign, and the utility of the brute myth in promoting this concern remained as much rhetorical as it was historical, as much about the glorious mystical light it cast on those presented as its heirs, as the evidence it offered for the legitimacy of their claims. However, interest in Scotland was soon to be usurped or reframed by war with France. The reign of Edward II saw defeat by the Scots, civil war, and the deposition of the king by his wife and her lover. And the early reign of Edward III hardly looked more promising. It began with the Queen Regent Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer at the helm, and the king still in his minority. In a 1327 campaign against the Scots, the ruinous discomfort of the English camps and the humiliating near capture of Edward III from his own tent forced the English to sign a shameful peace treaty at Northampton in 1328. In 1329, Robert Bruce died, and in 1331, his son David II was crowned at Scone, only to be temporarily ousted by the English barons in 1332. By this time, Edward III had overthrown Isabella and Mortimer, but the situation was still delicate. David II was under protection of the King of France, and a new threat was emerging. If Scotland and France joined forces and invaded England, their numbers would be catastrophic. By the mid-1330s, as Prestwich puts it, war with France, quote, diverted Edward III's energies from Scotland, end quote. It is not that his hostilities with Scotland ended, far from it, but it is at this juncture, when the English gaze shifts from Scotland to France, that our next and final case study comes to the fore. After the direct Capetian line had ended with Charles IV, the throne had passed to Philip of Valois. On the grounds of inheritance via the male line. In 1336, Philip confiscated Gascony from Edward III in retaliation for the English court's protection of a disgraced French baron. In 1337, Edward III laid claim to the French throne. In 1340, he made this claim official by assuming the title of the King of France. With this, he shifted his image, as Prestwich notes, from that of rebellious vassal to rightful ruler. In the same year, he quartered the French lilies and English leopards, assuming a new royal blazon, and that's what you can see here on this English noble. While the support of the population, not to mention the nobility, wavered before the first English victories against France, it is in the context of such bold self-fashioning on the part of the king that his subsequent popularity should be seen. These factors have significant bearing on the manuscript that formed the focus of my PhD. Egerton MS 3028, dated 1338 to 40, and which I'll call Egerton from now on, contains 3 illustrated Anglo-Norman poems, starting with a carefully abridged and adapted version of Wace's Roman de Brut. The Brut narrative, and especially the redaction in Egerton, is heavily concerned with King Arthur and his conquest first of France and then of Rome. Just over 10,000 lines of the original Wace poem are condensed into just 2,914, with special emphasis placed on Arthur's campaigns and with active demotion of episodes concerning Scotland. It is the Brut narrative is then followed or continued by a continuation to the early reign of Edward III. The two Fièvre narratives that follow the Waste Brut tell one story in two parts. The first part, La Destruction de Rome, follows the martial exploits of a Saracen prince called Fièvre. Here he is, in Egerton. He sacks Rome, steals Christ's relics, and takes them to his father's stronghold in Spain. This justifiably incites a punitive expedition from Charlemagne. Here he is. At the beginning of the second poem, Fièvre, the eponymous Saracen prince, loses in single combat to Charlemagne's loyal knight Oliver and converts to Christianity. The conversion of Fièvre and his sister Floripa results in the death of their father and the conquest of the Saracen stronghold by Charlemagne. So that's Waces Romans de Brut, heavily abridged with a continuation up to the reign of Edward III, followed by these two chansons de geste, which are two parts of one story. It's widely accepted that Egerton's text, even viewed apart from their illustrations, invite a political reading. Arthur and Charlemagne loom large, representing the mythic warlords of the British and French past. The continuation to the Brut text encourages the reader to view Edward III as the nexus for the imperial histories of Britain and France. It notes the marriage of King Ethelwulf to a French princess called Judith, historically the daughter of Charles the Bald, but states wrongly that she's the daughter of Charlemagne de France. The effect of this mistake, deliberate or otherwise, is that Charlemagne's progeny is presented as feeding directly into the English royal line. Then, the continuation's closing verses, which show unusual sympathy for the Despencer family and Edward II, end with a prayer for Edward III's victory against the French king. The lines read, "After him," that is Edward II, pictured above, "reigned his son, who is alive now. If it pleases God, may Edward the noble conqueror be kept, who is strong and held in great esteem, who has started great wars. For his right possessions, he makes conflict with the King of France on his land. God, who judges all things, give him the grace and power that he might gain victory. Amen." Here ends the Brut. This prayer falls centrally in the manuscript, between tales dominated by Arthur on the one hand and Charlemagne on the other. The political details of the prayer's request mean Egerton can have been made no earlier than 1338 to 40. He has started the war, but not yet had the major victory at Sluis. And this is probably not much later, given the style of the illustrations. However, the manuscript's origins and patronage are still up for debate. In my thesis, I suggest on textual and heraldic grounds that it may have been commissioned for the entertainment and political education of one Edmund FitzAlan, the then teenage son of Richard the Earl of Arundel and his wife Isabel le Despencer. I do not think it was the only manuscript of its kind, but I do believe its text and image to have been carefully adapted to the stipulations of the patron. The political applicability of Egerton's texts is deepened yet further by its decorative programme. Its 118 folios are decorated with 120 pen and wash miniatures in total, 2 of which are full-page portraits, one of Fièvre and one of Charlemagne. A third portrait, maybe of Arthur, is missing along with several quires from the start of the manuscript, and we can infer it would have been there because of the fact that the other 2 poems, the beginnings of which survive, open with these full-page portraits. Sadly, the part of the story concerning Brutus, Diana, and the giants is missing too. However, such is the consistency of this scheme that we can imagine how they might have been arranged. The use of heraldry across the Brut and Fièvre narratives deepens that political relevance even further. For instance, rather than the generic lion rampant borne by Oliver in a closely related version of the Fièvre texts, Egerton's artists have him holding azur à 3 fleurs de lis, or et chevron argent, emphasizing his relationship with Charlemagne. We'll come to this Hanover manuscript shortly, actually. So it's a sister manuscript of Egerton, but it doesn't contain the Brut. It just contains the Fièvre narratives and much longer versions with quite a few more illustrations, but it's extremely closely related. Similarly, in Hanover, whereas Charlemagne is sometimes shown with the eagle of the Holy Roman Emperor as well as the fleur-de-lis, in Egerton he only carries the latter, explicitly French blazon. And as has been noted before, Egerton's political interests are perhaps most striking on folio 41R of the Egerton Brut, where Frollo, the Roman governor of France, is shown holding a shield of 3 fleur-de-lis as he receives a death blow from King Arthur. And it couldn't really be more obvious what this manuscript is trying to encourage. In Egerton's Brut, British kings are consistently depicted bearing the royal arms of England, as Arthur is here, but this was not the default approach. In Royal MS 20A2, Arthur's shield is emblazoned with the Virgin and Child, and elsewhere his standard imputed coat of arms is 3 crowns. Given the Brut continuation's prayer in support of Edward III's claim to the French throne, it is hard not to see Egerton's heraldic programme as an endorsement for the English political agenda made explicit in the continuation. However simple and engaging its aesthetic, Egerton is, in Keith Busby's words, an engine of war. The narrative illustrations are embedded in the text and closely mirror its action, as well as its brevity and ambivalent attitude towards the supernatural. So unlike Royal MS 20A2, the Egerton artists really don't bother with showing visions or anything that's witnessed by anything supernatural that's witnessed by only one person. So for instance, Arthur's dream when they're in the ship going across to France of a boar in the sky, it just shows him sleeping in the ship and the sky is empty. And this isn't what we see so much as within Royal 20A2, where Vortigern's kind of imagining the prophecy taking place. And now I've lost. Thus, while the pictures help express a political argument, they do not have a great deal in common with the earlier manuscripts we've discussed in terms of their layout and legibility. Egerton's images are, in fact, most closely related to the illustrations of the aforementioned Hanover. It contains sister versions of the same 2 Fièvre texts as in Egerton, and both of these manuscripts have been seen by David Ross to be part of a small corpus of English illustrated manuscripts of Anglo-Norman verse romance concerned with legendary warlords like Charlemagne and Alexander the Great. These manuscripts are characterized by their visual cohesion and simplicity, the immediacy of their text-image relationship, and their overall accessibility. They are all a far cry from the guided interpretive readings demanded of the viewer in, say, the Vortigern spread of Royal MS 20A2. Of all the kinds of medieval manuscript available in England in the 13th and 14th centuries, these were surely among the most easily digestible, engaging, and entertaining. And perhaps that was the whole point. More research is needed into manuscripts designed for young readerships. Perhaps this is why these books look and read the way they do. So Egerton combines 2 things: the overtly political Brut subject matter found in Brut manuscripts from the reigns of Edward I and II, and the look of secular manuscripts of vernacular romance concerning legendary warlords. As I've already argued, these manuscripts implied not only the pedigree of the contemporary monarch and the legitimacy of his political ambitions, this is the Brut manuscripts, but also imbued that monarch's reign with a sense of ancient glory, of divinely ordained authority. By romancing or chanson de gesting its aesthetic, Egerton exhibits a novel emphasis on Edward I's contemporary political adventure as equal to the adventures of the legendary past, as part and parcel of the worlds of Arthur and Charlemagne. The whole scheme is abridged, simply illustrated and compelling. I'll just pop back to an Egerton image. It implies that contemporary politics is not only valid and illustrious, it is to be engaged with and enjoyed, just like the story of an ancient worthy. Historians celebrate Edward III's charisma as a war leader, both in terms of how he reinvented the enthusiastically bellicose culture in his grandfather Edward I's court, and how the literary world of Arthurian myth provided a model for the chivalric community that would prove instrumental to his victories. This can certainly be overstated, as prior to the first victories against France, indeed in the 1338 to 40 window, there was significant unrest among the aristocracy. However, books like Egerton, which may well reflect the personal politics of the patron, are a glimpse of one of the means by which Edward's plight became an English one. If anything were to stand as testament to the moral agreement readers felt in relation to the manuscripts of history and legend discussed here this evening, it is the small corpus of knife and pinholes in the faces and eyes of images of traitors that I have encountered in the course of my research. In 4 of the manuscripts discussed already, depictions of political traitors have been blinded or defaced with sharp metal tools. Several of the earliest examples of readers' punitive engagement with the stories appear in the circa 1250 Trinity Alexander, which is depicted here in the top left. This is a roman de toute chevalerie, the story of Alexander the Great, and it's in the corpus grouped together by David Ross of Anglo-Norman manuscripts, illustrated manuscripts. On folio 43R, 3 miniatures show Alexander lying on his deathbed, having divided his conquered kingdoms between his barons. The barons stand around him with sad expressions, and that's what you can see here, this group of crowned barons, very recently crowned barons. However, closer inspection shows that the barons' faces and eyes in all 3 miniatures have been pierced with the tip of a blade, leaving small incisions. At the end of the first column of folio 59V, we learn why these characters may have been singled out for punishment. And it says, "So when Alexander lived, the barons hated him, distracted by words and many sinister schemes, and betrayed him with poison like criminals." So we realize that these barons who are standing around his bed, having been given up Alexander's kingdoms and are looking all sad, were actually his murderers. And a reader has evidently decided to single them out for that and punish them. Another example of this kind of damage is found on folio 14R of Egerton. And I've shown that is the bottom left and top right. So there's a kind of far off one and a close up. The illustration shows King Constantine being struck down by another treacherous Pict, and the Pict's pupil has been pierced with a very thin, sharp tool. And this you go a bit mad, obviously, looking for these holes, and you think maybe I'm just imagining it. But in this case, there is no hole on the previous page, and this hole has pushed through to the text on the next page. So it shows it was really directed at that traitor's eye. And once you found a few, you think maybe this isn't just in my head. 2 further examples are found on the rise and fall of Vortigern spread of Royal MS 20A2, which we looked at earlier. They're in the eyes of the Pict killing Constance. So that's what I'm showing in the middle here. There's a tiny little line going through his pupil. You'll have to take my word for it if you can't see, or when the BL's open, see if you can order up the manuscript and have a gander. And they're also in the eyes. There are 2 tiny knife point incisions in the eyes of Vortigern, beneath the picture of himself burning to death. And so it's the one where he's looking out at the viewer between the Saxons and the Britons. We can be confident that the makers of these holes were medieval. All 4 manuscripts in which I've found examples, or that I've shown here, there are more examples, are in a script and form of French that would have been increasingly inaccessible in England after the Reformation. That separate readers committed the damage is likely, given that the manuscripts in this corpus are not stylistically similar enough to suggest they were made in the same place by the same people. Likewise, their later provenance seems them variously in family homes, the collections of the royal household, or disparate public collections. It is most likely that the damage was committed during the Middle Ages by various readers moved by these stories and able to read Anglo-Norman. Engagements of this nature suggest that the perpetrators not only agreed with the orthodox political outlook of the text and image, but that they felt roused enough to defend it with violence. Consumers of these books seized miniature weapons and rained down their punishments on the page. So let us return to Juliet Vale. Edward III's success in unifying the nobility has become almost commonplace in general textbooks of the period, but the mechanics of the process appear to have been little studied. Edward III was not unique in presenting war as adventure, and I do not think this is just about the unification of the nobility. However, I have come to see Egerton as an insight into the mechanisms of Edward's political successes, a codicological expression of one captivating way in which the 100 Years' War entered the homes and imaginations of the English. By means of an illustrated story, it presents the king and his baronial community as living legends, poised to fulfill the potential expressed by Diana to Brutus, to rule the whole round world. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Amy, for giving us such an interesting, well, for a lot of people, introduction, but for others, perhaps an analysis at a deeper level of some manuscripts which have been sitting around out there in collections. I mean, Bodley Rolls is pretty well known, 3 is pretty well known, but the other books really don't get very much attention. Everybody's excited about Illuminated Psalters and whatnot from the period, but these books have a lot to teach us about reading practices and about the interests of people that were not religious interests. We all have this idea that perhaps the art in the Middle Ages has got to do with commemoration and devotion, but actually a lot of it doesn't. And if it does, there's more to it than that. And I think your sort of work, Amy, is helping to show that. So it was absolutely marvelous to see that material and to hear it discussed so intelligently. We're going to take Q&A. Please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You'll see if you move your mouses, you'll see there's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you could put them there. A few people Q&A'd and chatted during the lecture, and I'm afraid I wasn't able to respond to them in the way that I would have liked. I'm sorry about that, I really am. But if you could put your questions now, then I'll read them out to Amy and Amy can answer them. Thank you. Okay, so some people put things in the chat, but no, that's not apropos. Okay.
Sorry to the person who asked for me to slow down and lift my head up. I hope it didn't completely ruin everything, that I didn't see that question.
I did see it, and it's on my conscience because I said I didn't want to ask you in mid-flow to slow down. Yeah. And, you know, it's a thing, if we were in a lecture hall, it would be relatively easy to do that. But
I apologise to anonymous attendee for that.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Amy, Julian,
yes, Richard.
Can't, because I'm a panelist, access the Q&A box. At least I think that's right. So can I ask my question vocally?
Yes.
What, Amy, were they using to stab the eyes out of all those? Sorry, first of all, what a terrific paper. Could you give one every evening? And secondly, what were they using to stab the eyes out with? And are the other examples you have of such sort of defacement also eye-based?
The majority are eye-based, and I can tell you, so one of the manuscripts that I found this in is the Histoire de Saint-Edouard le Rey, the history of Edward the King. It's in Cambridge University Library, and it's applied to the face of Earl Godwin twice in two separate images of Earl Godwin. And from the way it's done there, you can get some sense of what the tool was, because they are tiny burn holes and they're circular, and the first hole in each case, the one hole is bigger than the other, suggesting that it was a highly conductive material and that it cooled down rapidly. And I ordered, William Cowley very kindly sent some parchment scraps when I was an MA student living in London, and I sat in my little flat with a safety pin and a candle and burned holes in parchment, and it worked really well. And so I was, in that case, I'm thinking a metal pin. But in the case of Royal MS 20A2, for instance, it's this tiny incision, like as if it were the tip of a blade. In the case of Egerton, it's not heat. None of the other cases outside of the Edward are heated, and so the one in Egerton seems to be a very tiny, sharp object, like an embroidery needle, because it's practically invisible. And it's only, I actually called Lloyd up to the reading room because I knew he was in the BL when I found it, and said, "I'm not mad, am I? There is something here." And he might be mad too, but he agreed. So yeah, possibly pins, embroidery, the kind of, because I sort of am interested in whether these were read in domestic spaces. I imagine embroidery needles and sharp blades were things that were easily accessible in those environments, but that's me going off on one.
Yes, I think people used to own pins in the Middle Ages and carry them around in a way we just don't anymore. You often find pins bequeathed and things like that. Yes. Do we have? Yeah, we've got two questions in the Q&A. So Michael says, "Thank you, Amy. That was a wonderful presentation. Could you comment on the date of the Egerton manuscript? And are we sure the armorials are contemporary with the miniatures?" No pressure there coming from Michael, but yeah.
I don't see any reason to date Egerton much later than the date suggested by the prayer.
Can you remind us what that is again, Amy? Sorry.
1338 to 40. Yeah. Because the armour hasn't undergone the dramatic change it undergoes in the 1340s. There's more on this in my thesis, but that's was my. I don't see why it would be much later. And also it's odd that it doesn't include the quartered arms of England and France, which you think if it was definitely after 1340, why would you have just the English leopards all the way through? So I don't have a positive answer to that question, but more a kind of, well, the armour looks the way it does and the heraldry is the way it does. It is. As the second part of your question, whether the armorials are contemporary with the miniatures, the way that the gilding is applied in Egerton is quite distinctive, and it's often surrounded by a thick black line that's really ugly, and you think that maybe the gilding and the heraldry was done later, but it's actually very similar to the way the gilding's done in the manuscript in Hanover. And if they were made as I think they were in a similar context, then why would somebody come and add metalwork to two separate manuscripts much after they were made? So, and the gilding, there's gilding applied to Charlemagne's fleur-de-lis in his heraldry. So if his heraldry is, yeah, and also the colouring of the armorials, it's the same colours, same pigments are used as on the clothing, and some of that kind of, there are also correlations with the first text in Hanover, the Hanover manuscript there. And so there's just sort of, again, things that make it look more likely that it's all contemporary than that somebody came in later and redid it. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Okay. There. I mean, that's a combination of factors there that go to. I mean, this is always somebody manuscript person always asks, "Oh, wasn't the heraldry added later or something?" I mean, another thing. Sorry, Amy.
Sorry, Michael's just followed up with another question, but carry on.
No, I was just going to say that an obvious thing to say is, why would they have left it all blank? And there's several reasons one could give to that. But I mean, if you care about a common hypothesis, you're going to think that they did it at the time. If it looks a little bit different, well, perhaps because a different artist did it who knew how to do heraldry. Michael says, "It's just that, as I understand it, the French arms are France modern, therefore after circa 1390.
So the arms that Frollo is shown holding, where he's being smacked on the head by Arthur, I think they're the three fleur-de-lis in it that is France moderne. I can't, and the ones where the fleur-de-lis is scattered is the earlier one. I think I'm right in remembering it that way, and that's what Charlemagne's holding, the scattered ones. Whereas Frollo, who isn't actually the King of France, he's just the governor of Gaul, is carrying the three fleur-de-lis, which is just showing his relationship to the government of France as opposed to his status at the top, his sovereignty.
Yeah. Okay. So these conversations can get hermetic and scholastic, and we can never be sure about it. Michael, thank you very
so
much for that.
Questions, Michael.
Somebody in the chat has said fascinating and very useful. Thank you for this scholarship and making it accessible to a non-expert like myself. I'll be more confident using these legendary classical sources in my medieval fiction with this background. That's from Kate Innes. So that's nice. Kate, thank you, Kate. Yeah. There's some very interesting things about this Egerton manuscript that didn't come into you, that were relevant to what you're talking about. And you did, though, show the tomb of Edward II, which was interesting, given how celebrated a monument the tomb of Edward II is. And you might also have mentioned the tomb of Athelstan, although, of course, that's not so celebrated. But it was interesting to see the tomb of Edward II. I wonder if you would say something about that in relation to the actual tomb as it stands.
Yeah. So I'm not convinced that it's an indication that the artist, the Egerton artist, had seen the tomb. I think it's a generic. There's an excellent article by Joel Burden on the peculiar funeral of Edward II, and it talks about the kind of orthodoxy of the funeral as a way of glossing over a very unorthodox succession, and I think that what that image of the tomb in Egerton, well, I'll just scoot through. Can I? Hang on, see if I can find the slide.
I think some people listening will know the tomb and be interested in the tomb more than the manuscript. So that's why I asked it.
Right, well, what to say? Well, it's interesting that the manuscript talks about that people had come to the tomb and been healed. And so that it was, at least when this text was written, was seen as having the potential to become a shrine. And earlier in the manuscript, you see the tomb of Edward the Confessor, and some similar language is used. Alison Stones, in her article on Egerton, notes the similarity in the language around the tomb of Edward the Confessor and the tomb of Edward II. And so here on this page, you can see 30 ans, first line, he reigned in power, that's Edward II, and when he was dead and finished, he was carried to Gloucester and buried with great honour. And then he says, Dieu, straight after the illustration, Dieu l'a grandement honoré, God had greatly honoured him, as many men were delivered from their suffering, and Dieu, so then right before the red A, Dieu pour lui grand miracle a fait, like God had done great miracles on his behalf. And so this is a real statement of support for Edward II's cult, which there is some discussion, I believe, by our illustrious chair of the how that impacted on the Gothic refurbishment of Gloucester Cathedral.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Amy, for talking about that, because it is an interesting point. And, I tend to agree that, not that my word is any more important than anyone else's, but, it just doesn't look like it, does it? Alex Bovey says, really wonderful paper, Amy. I have lots of questions, for example, about young people using such books. And I think that is something that people, that came out in your talk and was very interesting and people might like to hear more about. But she says, what I'd really like to ask now is about whether your own art practice, creating in effect a cycle of mythic images for Britain in the 2020s, has provoked fresh insights into your interpretation of these medieval images. So if you answer that, Amy, perhaps you would just say a very little bit about what your current non-academic project or para-academic project.
Yes, so I as a kind of procrastination, but like a useful procrastination project at the end of when I was writing up my thesis, I started doing lino cuts illustrating Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, and it was so that I could, well, it's because I knew that it had been very little illustrated in the Middle Ages, and I was worried about choosing a subject that would be a cliche, and I thought, well, I know this one won't because it's full of visual potential. And that there was a kind of symbiotic process, I suppose, in that I pinched devices for doing the illustrations from the medieval sources. So, for instance, whenever I wanted to depict prophecy or visions, I'd have the one receiving the vision on the right, looking over their left shoulder, and then the vision happening in the top left, as happens in the Edward manuscript. In the Cambridge University Library, and he's having his vision of the seven sleepers of Ephesus, but you see that elsewhere. And also in the the way that Vortigern's looking up at an image, it interrupts the left to right narrative flow. And I always imagined the pictures I was making embedded in the text in the same way as Egerton is going. All of the Egerton images are on the recto of the double page spread, and they're always just following the action, or pretty much always just following the action, so you get this strong narrative momentum. Did it cast fresh insights going the other direction? Yes, in that I realized how hard it is when I was wondering about the abridgments in Egerton. And I thought, well, it's one of the reasons that it was so heavily abridged, because it was intended to receive illustration. When I started illustrating it, I realized how much of the brute narrative is very difficult, or WAS particularly, is dialogue or description, and where the action doesn't change, and that actually, if you want to create dynamic, engaging illustrations, you need something to happen. And so it sort of suddenly made sense that this 10,000 line poem or 11,000 line poem had been condensed down to 3,000 lines, and things like dialogue and description had been cut. And I thought, well, if the adaptations were made with the intention of the whole thing being illustrated, then it makes real sense, because it's ensuring that there's fresh action on every spread, which is what you get in Egerton. So
Thank you very much, Amy. We have here a comment which I think is worth reading out from Anne-Marie Rasmussen.
Oh,
She says, one of the many things that I, a scholar of German medieval culture and literature, so appreciate about your work, Amy, is that it attends so carefully to the dialogue between text and image, and shows us how they together appropriate and adapt legendary materials for contemporary purposes, in this case, political ones. I wonder if you would like to comment on the process of working across disciplines, in your case, working with the scholarship of literary scholars. So yeah, what's it like being both a literary historian and an art historian, basically?
I still worry about the words I'm using, and I know, and I'm very grateful for literary historian colleagues who advise me on these things. I suppose that there was, because I began my academic career doing ASNAC, Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, as an undergraduate, and I began with languages and literature, and then jumped in my third year into art history, but focused on the Middle Ages and manuscripts in particular, and then did manuscripts of John Loudon, text and image. I don't think I've ever not been sitting with, with both, juggling both things, or looking at both together. So I don't know how, it just makes so much sense to read them together, because you get this wonderful mutual enrichment.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people who are here listening to this lecture can relate to that. But it is hard to do at the level you're doing it at. It's difficult work to do.
Yeah,
I wonder if
Anne-Marie works on badges, medieval badges, and that
yes.
It's very, very helpful in that case, especially with the secular ones, to have a good oversight of the secular, especially secular, but also hagiographical literature of the period. So thank you, Anne-Marie, for that question.
Perhaps you would say a little bit more about younger people using these books, and these books is basically educational as well as entertaining, you know.
There's
younger.
a word that Alex Bovey uses, which is edutainspirational, which is probably
It's a good one.
I think that it's hard again to find definitive proof that but we know, for instance, that those densely illustrated Saints' Lives by Matthew Paris were and again Anglo-Norman with these embedded illustrations and very in a similarly engaging pen and wash style were circulating among noble women, and we know there's strong evidence that noble women took an active role in the education of their children. And you think, well, if you're going to take an active role in any part of their education, it would be in the reading of stories. And these books they're not suited to display. You wouldn't just read aloud from them with no one looking because they've got pictures in. You know, they are shoulder to shoulder reading. Egerton's only, you know, smaller than an iPad. They're not. And the reason I didn't go into long discussion of the French stuff that's similar to this is that has a more glitzy aesthetic. This is something about this that is intimate, and about these particular books. And in Hanover, for instance, there are some really sweet little doodles in the margins that just look like children's sketches. And again, with the abridgments in Egerton, especially, you feel as though the attention span of a younger reader is being taken into account. So yes. It's something I'm still exploring, especially in relation to the enculturation of male elite and the legacy of ancient Greek paideia. But yeah, more about that in the future, I hope.
Yes, thank you very much, Amy. And I suppose what you've said makes a lot of sense. One can just, you know, one can not try and prove something that one can't prove, but one can say, look, this book is made in a way that would have suited it to use for younger people as well as adults. And that's probably the nearest we can get with it. But that is interesting, and we don't perhaps think enough about this or look for the evidence enough.
There is a really brilliant image in the Badapage of an Alexander manuscript that was made in Holland. It's a Flemish product, but for an English patron, and it shows in the Badapage two separate scenes of a puppet show, one being watched by a group of girls and one being watched by a group of boys. And the one being watched by the girls, they're all sitting demurely on the floor, covering their bits in this slightly strange way. And the puppet show shows a big man with a big club hitting a woman in a white dress on the head. And the other puppet show shows with the boys are kind of standing there and they're talking to each other and they're engaged and they are pointing at their dagger handles suggestively. And the puppet show, it shows two knights in combat. And I think I was particularly interested in the way these manuscripts might have been designed for sort of young male chivalric classes, as like active and engaging and exciting narratives. And that puppet show vignette I found really helpful.
Yeah, no qualms about gender essentialism in the Middle Ages. So does anybody else have a question we want to ask Amy? I suppose some people are wondering, just before, while we've got you here, Amy, and noticing the big difference in the style of the script between Egerton and Hanover. Hanover is much more the sort of thing we would expect in the period, you know. This is, I mean, they're both Anglicana hands. This one's like almost like a sort of fair textura hand. It's almost like they're trying to imitate, in a way, some sort of formal script. Do you know what I mean? And I wonder if you looked into that, because that is rather unusual.
Yeah, it's a shame. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, please. I was just going to say, particularly for writing out this sort of book, but yeah.
Yeah, the Egerton hand is very strange, and I haven't found anything like it. It hadn't occurred to me that it might have been a deliberate stylistic choice. One thing I know is that when you hold Egerton in your hand and look at it in the flesh, it's a lot more delicate than it ever looks. I mean, every time I've gone to see it, I've gone, oh, you're so much prettier in real life than you look on the screen. like some kind of dating app situation. But the problem with Hanover is that there's actually 2 scribes. This one that I've got up on the screen, and I think the only one that I actually know. This is possibly, basically there's the first scribe has a less curly whirly hand than this one, and maybe if they are products of some kind of group of makers, there's 3 or more scribes at work. I don't know. I can't give you anything more.
No, okay. I just wondered if you'd look. Okay, people are starting to drift off, and we should let you go, Amy, because you've given us a lot of your time. Needless to say, we're exceedingly grateful to you for giving us this talk. It's not the sort of talk we have had a lot of in the BAA, but perhaps we should have more of them. It was fascinating. Thank you so much. Before more people leave, I'd like to remind you that on the 3rd of March, we have another lecture, and it's going to be given by Meg Bolton, Dr. Meg Bolton, who's at Edinburgh University. And Meg is speaking to us under the title, Angels on the Edge, Constructing Sacred Space in the Art and Architecture of Early Medieval England. So that's worth looking forward to. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope to see you all then.